Today, I'm going to be talking about the concept of self-esteem. And I've got to tell you that this became popular between the time when I went to high school and by the time I had children in school. And it has infected everybody. I have even had members of the church tell me that we needed to have lessons on helping their children achieve a higher self-esteem. And I had no idea at the time that this was such a movement inside the school system and why it was becoming so popular. Of course, my response when a Christian would tell me that is, you're not supposed to have high self-esteem. You're supposed to realize how low you were, and only through God do you have self-esteem. So I just told you the end of my lesson. So now I'm going to kind of work my way back up to that. The definition of self-esteem is a feeling of having respect for yourself. By the way, self-esteem isn't one word, it's two. So it's one of those, it's a conceptual definition. And it's about having respect for yourself and your abilities, a confidence and satisfaction in oneself. And here's part of the issue here. The synonyms for it are ego, pride, pridefulness, self-regard, and self-respect. So right away you can start seeing that by doing this self-esteem thing, you're moving in a direction that the Bible warns us against. In the 1980s, it arose to national attention. And in 1986, California passed legislation. And this is a write-up by one of the people who has looked back at this event and kind of raised some issues with it. Well, I'm going to read it. It's for true believers who want to be school reformers, enamored with the social, emotional skills that the 21st century student must learn if they're to be successful in an information-driven economy and social media-ridden daily life. Take a brief look at the self-esteem movement launched in the 80s, and the subsequent decades reformers stressed that students as well as teachers needed to be confident, have self-regard, and a psychological repertoire of personal and social skills. Not only were they to have high self-esteem, but they were also expected to display such attitudes and skills. So what this is saying is that there was this movement to create an awareness of yourself, and that you were supposed to feed into yourself, that you're a good person. I'm good. Brad actually brought this up in a lesson a couple of weeks ago. He quoted somebody from Saturday Night Live who later became a senator. He played a person named Guy Smalley. I think it was Guy Smiley or Guy Smalley. And he would always end his little talks with, I'm good enough, I'm nice enough, and gosh darn it, people like me. And that was kind of in this self-esteem model of how a person was supposed to think about themselves. The legislation that California passed basically created a task force, and it funded them. Now, this is who they put on the task force. It was a bunch of New Age believers, of course, because this is the New Age belief, gay activists, law enforcement, and fundamental Christians. And so right now you're starting to see that this sounded like a good idea. Your children need to have high self-esteem. They need to think highly of themselves. You need to feed that into them so that, little Johnny and little Mary will feel really good about themselves. And it sounded like a good idea. It was, because California did it. If you don't know, when California does something like this, almost every other state usually passes legislation or tries to copy it, quite unfortunately. This was their slogan: I want you to realize, you're a wonderful and special person. And this was kind of the slogan this actually was the slogan of that group. And the idea being that you don't have to pass a test or prove anything or actually have any skills. You're just a special person because of who you are, whoever you are, and whatever you are, and whatever skill you have, that has to be great, was kind of the motto. This was bipartisan, by the way. House Republicans and House senators both passed legislation to fund this effort because it sounded so right. And it sounded, parents and conservatives, progressives, everybody thought this was a good idea back in 1986. And as a result, a lot of the media and a lot of the reporting and a lot of what went on in schools was tied to this. By the way, this was the beginning of what you now see as this woke movement. This is these group of people, which, by the way, just to jump ahead, after they found out they really weren't that special, when they grew up, because this group of people now would be in their 30s, the children that went through this, as they grew up, they discovered they weren't that great, and they had a lot of psychological issues because of that. All right, so then the soon enough, there's another article that basically made this quote, and I don't have my reference here, I must have left it off, but soon enough, the phrase self-esteem became attached to schools and classroom practices of frequent praise for children and emphasis on participation in activities rather than individual academic performance. So if you can tell what's going on, there was actually a game, and some of you, we have some people that age group in this audience, so there was they'd get like a foam ball and they'd pass it around, and when you passed it, whatever person caught the ball, you'd have to give them a compliment. Oh, you look nice today. And then you throw the ball to somebody else, they catch the ball, and you have to give them a compliment. And the whole idea was you just go around the room, no, you're good, no, you're good, no, you're good. And that was kind of the model that if you raise children like this, the concept would be that they would improve. Everything about them would be better, and you would see a better example of their life would be a better example and a better existence because they have this better self-image, this great self-image. And their concept went like this. You see great individuals, and a couple of them were mentioned. You see great individuals, and they all seem to have great self-esteem. So let me just name a few of them. Steve Jobs. Now, for those of you who are maybe too young to know, he passed away of pancreatic cancer, and a couple of years ago, maybe 10 years ago by now. But Steve Jobs built Apple, and then he left Apple, and Apple went and got into trouble, and then he came back and saved Apple. And the Apple you know today with the iPhone and all that stuff, that's all Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs was a maniac, and he was, actually when I was young, he was one of my heroes. He was just an amazing engineer. If you look at an iPad, or you take your iPhone apart, you're not going to believe what you're going to see inside. It's a bunch of hand-wired stuff. It does not look like a super, slick electronic circuit. And because he was willing to do that, he was able to make, something no one had ever seen before, an iPad, a computer you hold in your hand, and it does super cool things. It's only about a quarter of an inch thick. That was Steve Jobs. He had a very high opinion of himself. He had great self-esteem. So there's an example. Bill Gates. Bill Gates also has great self-esteem. He's the guy kind of going around pushing vaccines and global warming nowadays, but he used to be in charge of Microsoft, and Microsoft became wonderful under him, and he's a man of pretty high self-esteem. And then the other one they used is somebody I know very well, Michael Dell. I actually worked for Michael, and he has pretty high self-esteem. He went from his dorm room in college, dropped out of college, built the computer, and built the company Dell. And truth be known, the great machine of Dell was built by somebody he hired, Mort Topfer, and they built one of the buildings in Austin is named the Mort Topfer building. But he's the one that built the build it as you go, call it, order your computer today and it ships tomorrow, built for you. But these are well-known men in the tech industry, and they all have very high self-esteem. And everybody thought, well, see, if you have high self-esteem, you can accomplish great things. I think the problem they missed was these men got their high self-esteem because of their accomplishments. I'm not sure they had high self-esteem when they were younger, but they had it now. So I think this movement got it backwards. If you have a lot of accomplishments, you probably do have high self-esteem. but you don't start with high self-esteem and then build into the accomplishments. That was a big mistake. And so there were no vast studies. There were no studies that said if you gave children this mindset of how wonderful they are, I'm good enough. I do everything wonderful. If you give children this mindset, there's been no studies that said they would actually achieve more or do better. But everybody believed it, and even after the information started coming in that showed the children weren't that much better, it didn't stop them. This idea just took a life of its own. It sounded good. And it created this tension between boosting the child's self-image and attaining a high academic performance. And it can be traced back to this movement. And you see this tension forming, like spend a lot of time in the school teaching the child how nice they are, but it takes away from teaching them math facts and all these other things that we used to teach. And so it was expected that the curriculum would do both. And that was the point of this argument by Larry Cuban, is that this was the professed direction that this system was supposed to go. In other words, they were going to add this self-esteem model to this process. And instead what it ended up doing is it ended up replacing some of the education. So a lot of the kids came out and suddenly they weren't as good at math. And by the way, one of the expectations was the United States was behind, its children were graduating academically behind other nations like China and India and Europe, some of the European nations. And so this idea of raising their self-esteem was supposed to fix all that. It was supposed to say, well, look, if a child thinks more of themselves, maybe they won't get on drugs, they won't smoke, they won't be promiscuous, they won't rob banks and do other crazy things. But instead what happened is they did all those things worse. So we actually ended up just a decade or two after going into this process, we end up with a youth coming out of college and high school that are more into drugs, more into promiscuity, more into higher teen pregnancy, higher dropout rates, even lower grades, and worse competition against the international schools. That was the result. And the next thing we did, we started seeing this coming up in our culture. So you see this book, The Lovables. This is a book, I don't know if I'd never heard of this book before, but obviously this was in between my kids and grandkids, I guess. So I never saw this book, but it was a thing about that you're a lovable. The Lovables is you and the person reading this book, and you're special and you're lovable. And it'd be hard to overstate the long-term impact of these claims. Self-esteem craze changed how countless organizations were run. This worked its way into business. Any of you guys ever heard of the I'm Okay, You're Okay book? That was one of these books based on this self-esteem. And it affected an entire generation of the millennials. And the central, as it turned out, the central claim underlying this was almost certainly inaccurate. They began to see that the idea of teaching self-esteem was not actually going to make your children better. Matter of fact, it became pretty obvious it was hurting them in ways. But by now, everybody was on board. And books like this came out. This Jesse Singal is the editor in this movie, or this online magazine, The Cut. And his argument is many people still believe fostering a sense of self-esteem is just about the most important thing one can do mental health-wise. And I'm going to argue, I think I've heard this from countless, especially parents with young children. And I mean inside the church, I've heard this. They're really worried about their child's self-esteem. And I think the problem is the words we're using, self-esteem. I think a child needs to have an appropriate sense of who they are and what they're good at and what they aren't. But let me just give you an example. I have a grandson he's now 14. I'm going to probably get in trouble because he's older than I think he's 14. He's a freshman. He was in band, and his band went to state, which is pretty cool for band. School's brand new. School's only been open 2 years. Doesn't have a single senior on there is no seniors in the school, much less on the band. So you can imagine a band with no seniors, being at state was a pretty big thing. But when he was a little boy, all he wanted to be was a receiver. That's what he wanted. He wanted to catch the football. And I can tell you, I spent countless hours throwing the football to him. I mean, I'm talking about hundreds of hours. If he came over for Thanksgiving, as soon as we ate, we'd be throwing the ball for 2 hours. And he was tireless at just running and catching the ball. And I really worked with him. I mean, I started with him when he was about 6 with throwing a foam ball. And by the time he was 10 or 11, I was throwing the junior high school size football. And I was throwing it hard, trying to hit. One time I knocked the wind out of him, and his mother got mad at me. But the bottom line was this kid knew how to catch. I taught him to catch one-handed. I taught him not to turn his face, you know, because young people, they want to turn when the ball comes. I really worked with him. And so one year, after we'd been finished playing, he was about 10 years old maybe, he turned to me and he said, "Granddaddy, am I not the best receiver you've ever seen?" See, because he knew about self-esteem, right? And I told him, "No, that's Odell Beckham Jr., and you're not even close." And the looks I got from my son and his wife, you'd have thought I shot him, because I informed him he wasn't the best. And that was the year, by the way, did everybody see that catch when he was in the New York Giants? He catches one-handed over his back and lands in the end zone. That was the catch. And I've never seen anybody do that before or since. But anyway, I used Odell Beckham as his example. Then I went and got the video of that and I showed it to him, trying to prove to him that he wasn't the world's best receiver. But it was kind of a shock to me that that's what was in his head, that's what had been put in his head by somebody. Because when I did things when I was a kid, I knew I wasn't the world's best at it. I knew I was still learning. But it is an important thing for us to understand. Well, this book, The Lovables, was fodder for the children to read. This next cartoon shows, this is kind of the themistic cartoon of this era. And the child, if you can't read the numbers, he's added up 62 times 7, and he came up with 627. So he wrote the numbers side by side. That's wrong. And he says, before you say anything, remember the educational importance of my self-esteem. and this is probably not too funny. I mean, it's probably not too far from what was really going on in the classroom. That children today, it's even worse. Children today don't have to behave. They don't have to put their cell phones away. The teacher can't do anything about it. It's become a mess. Probably not as bad here in Texas, but it's bad all over the country. Well, another book got written, Chicken Soup for the Soul. And everybody's heard of this book, right? You can't have lived and walked through a bookstore and not seen this book. It's a compilation of a bunch of ordinary people who did extraordinary things. And that's not bad. That's not a bad thing to do. But it's based on this idea that if you just believe in yourself, you can do anything, you can be anything. And you've heard people tell their children, you can be anything. Even if they are bad at what they're doing, they can tell them, you can be anything, you can do anything. Well, that's a very difficult message for a child to receive and then grow up and realize they have limitations. They are really not the best. This book now they produce about 6 of these books a year. There's now one of these for everything. You know, the Chicken Soup for the Soul, dog lover, teenager, mother, cancer survivor, just about any group of people you can imagine, there's a chicken soup for them. And this book was kind of the anthem of this movement. It is, you should think very highly of yourself, very good, because you can be and do anything if you just put your mind to it. But that's not the results we got. So in the 80s, you remember, this is when children started bringing guns to school and killing each other. That didn't happen in the 60s and 70s. Matter of fact, when I went to school, you could bring your gun to school. You usually left it in the car, and you go hunting on the way home. Or you could show it off. It was not at all uncommon to see guns in the parking lot when I was in school with a gun rack on them, with guns on the gun rack. They weren't illegal. No one ever brought them in and shot anybody. But they did in the 80s, right after this, right in the early 90s, right after this. And by the way, the average mass shooter is 27 years old. The average. There's been one of them that was 50-something in Las Vegas. The rest of them have all been children or young adults. And they're all these people who have had this, I'm okay, you're okay, you can be anything you want to be, taught to them, even when the outcome was not good. So this thing failed miserably. And I wanted to say, Brad mentioned this about our culture. This is what's wrong with this idea. I'm okay. That takes away your ability for you to then make a mistake. If your parents taught you were perfect and wonderful at everything, the first time you fail, you kind of got to hide it. Because, I don't want my parents who think I'm perfect at anything to see this. I spent about a month over in China in between when I worked at Dell and when I went to Micron. I retired for a little bit and I started consulting. This was a consulting role. I go to China with the company Huawei, and I'm actually saying it correctly, so it's Huwei, Huawei, and it's a well-known company. It's considered to be an espionage spy organization by the CIA. This company, their product set is actually, all the products are stolen, mostly from Cisco. Because they're from China, they just take the parts of product and copy it and put it back together again, do everything. That would be illegal in any other country, but not in China. So China, this is their largest tech company. This is the big tech company in China. They hired me to come and tell them what I saw in their storage business. Well, their storage business had 5,000 employees and $400 million in profit, $400 million in revenue for that year. And so they weren't making any money on this. And so I asked the engineering team to come in and tell me what you see and what products you're looking at. Well, they were dumbfounded by the question. What products are you looking at for your next generation products? Because they're looking at stealing something from EMC or something from NetApp, one of the storage companies here in the US. And I asked them, I said, no, but you've got some storage products. Can you not advance those on your own? So we had an engineering meeting to brainstorm some ideas. I couldn't get a single engineer to make a single comment, not one. Now, I had a translator, so I was not sure. I had to keep asking him, are you saying what I'm saying? And the answer is, they're scared to death to fail in front of their boss. They're scared to death to bring up an idea because it might be stupid. In America, we're not afraid of that. The reason why American economy is so great is because people do stupid stuff all the time and it turns out to work. And they become Steve Jobs with Apple or Michael Dell with Dell Corporation. Our country is built on the back of failure. Thomas Edison has a famous quote. He said, someone asked him when he made the light bulb, he said, you failed 10,000 times. How do you feel about that? He said, I didn't fail 10,000 times. I found 10,000 ways that won't work. He had a very different opinion, and so do most entrepreneurs in the United States. They're not afraid to fail because our culture it's okay to fail. It's okay to have risk, but not if you go through this. Not if you've been part of this culturalization that says you're already perfect and failure is not an option. A perfect person shouldn't be dropping the football, shouldn't be failing. See the next slide. This is a book written by Jean Twenge. She's actually quoted by Jordan Peterson. And she wrote this about this self-esteem movement, and this is actually what he's quoting from. The self-esteem movement, at least one factor in explaining why millennials have higher self-esteem and are more likely to see themselves above average, and in general have more positive views than the previous generation did at the same age. She said, I also think it may explain why they score higher in measures of narcissism and personality, the narcissism personality traits. So the issue here is, and her book is Generation Me and Why Millennials Are Miserable. And so this is what's literally become of this training. By the way, it hasn't gone away. It has kind of morphed into some other different kinds of training as we As we sit here today, the school system is still teaching this. Jordan Peterson, I mentioned him earlier. Brad mentioned him, and I like this quote. He was the modern-day John the Baptist. And if you remember that lesson, Brad was basically teaching that John the Baptist came. He wasn't Christ. He was the forerunner, and he was paving the way. So he was, using a lot of the same words, waking people up to the ideas. But then Christ came and taught his ministry. And Jordan Peterson's kind of that kind of a guy. It's interesting. He has over 4 million subscribers. So if you know nothing else about YouTube, you should know that 200,000 is a big number for subscribers. 4 million is insanely high. He talks about self-esteem. And in his talk about self-esteem, he talks about the 5 fundamental personality traits. There's been a lot of studies done about these 5 traits. He explains that self-esteem doesn't really exist. That what you're really talking about is people have a quotient, a personality trait of conscientiousness, what they think of themselves, and then they have narcissism, which is what they think is wrong with themselves. And if you subtract narcissism, all your good traits and all your bad traits, that's what you should think of yourself. It's all the good things you do and all the weaknesses you have, and the sum of those two is your true nature. And that is what is about. Now, the trick to this is he makes the point that psychiatrists know quite very well that you can't change a person's narcissistic ways. You just can't manipulate that. So you start telling children they're great when they're very young, you jump over that step, but then they never develop this concept of what I'm good at and what I'm not good at. So now we're going to go to the Bible, and we're going to look at what the Bible says about how we should think about ourselves. And this is critical because we live in this world still. This is still going on. It's a very common theme in our culture that everybody's supposed to think they're wonderful, and the higher you think of yourself, the more well-balanced of a person you are. But that's not what the Bible teaches. So here's just Romans 12, and I tend to use the Romans 12 verses a lot. So, but it's only because it's kind of it's a cookbook on how to grow and to be a better Christian. And it says, "For by grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think more highly of himself than he ought to think, but to think with sober judgment." So, not to think more highly of yourself. And it says, "then you ought to." So it's clearly giving you a direction. Your opinion of yourself should be based on what you are, what you're good at, what you're not good at. Now, it's okay for you to be aware that you're good at some things. You might be good at sitting with people and listening to them. And when someone has a loss in their life, that's a perfect skill set to go sit with somebody who's dealing with tragedy or dealing with issues. It's a great skill set to have as a Christian. You might be a great organizer. Well, things need organizing, so that's a great skill set. There's nothing wrong with recognizing what you're good at. What's wrong is when you start trying to make other traits some of this, like I'm pretty and I'm thin and I'm well dressed and I people like me and those kind of things are they're more judgmental, and they're not thinking soberly. And so this sober judgment means you're supposed to be moderating what you think of yourself. The word sober in the Greek word for this is moderation, that you should think of yourself with moderate judgment. In other words, don't exaggerate what you think of yourself. Live in harmony with one another, and do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Never be conceited. Haughty is a great word here. It's actually a really good translation. It says, don't be arrogant. Don't think too highly of yourself. And then it says, associate with the lowly. That's interesting. We are supposed to keep in touch with the lowly. And if you're a Christian, you're surrounded by people at all levels of their Christian walk. And so you will see people that are lowly, and you'll see people that are have mastered things. But you should be sure and hang around a lot with the lowly, because you're supposed to stay connected with that. Never be conceited. Don't think too much of yourself. Next slide. And this was my initial opening slide. It was up there for a minute, but I'm going to read it now. It says, "But when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees. This is Jesus they're thinking about. They gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked the question to test him, "Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law?" And he said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets." Now, the reason why I picked this verse was because of that last statement, that when Jesus was asked about the greatest commandment in the law, he not only tells you that loving God, which, by the way, I think for everybody in this room who's already a Christian, loving God and putting him in the right places is pretty easy. You probably had to do that before you submitted and became a Christian. So loving God's the easy part. This is loving everybody else. That's the hard part. And he says, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Remember, yourself, you're not supposed to think too highly of to begin with, but you're supposed to love your neighbor as yourself. And then he tells you that all the laws and the commandments that God has ever given are based upon these two concepts. And that is what is interesting, because this concept that you love your neighbor as yourself is really saying put your neighbor first. So this point being that service to other people, this love, by the way, agape, we try to explain what this word means, because in the English language we have one word for love, and it kind of, you can love an apple pie, and you can love your wife, you can love this book. We use the word, the context changes. In Greek they had many words for love, and agape is one of them, and it's one of the ones that is harder to explain. I usually refer to it as duty. But I read something very interesting. It came out of a commentary on something Vines wrote, and it basically said that this is the love that God showed mankind when he gave Christ, his son, to be crucified. This is that kind of love. And then now that puts it in a completely different light. Now realize this is the divine version of love that puts other people first. I mean, God certainly didn't want to sacrifice Jesus. Jesus didn't want to be sacrificed. You can tell that by his prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane, but he was willing to do it, and it was painful, and he went through this. But he did that. That's a love of service. That when you let yourself go through that kind of pain for someone else, that is duty, that's service. That's the encapsulation of the concept agape. Well, that's what this word is. This is the word agape used for that. Next slide. Matthew 25:31, and I'm going to go all the way through 46. I'm going to read this. This is a scene on the day of judgment of the King, which is Christ, separating the good from the bad on that day of judgment. And he says, so when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit in his glorious throne. Before him will be gathered all the nations, and he will separate the people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will place the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, come, you all who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For as I was hungry, and you gave me food, I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. Then the righteous will answer him. Now he's talking to the ones on the right. The righteous will answer him, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you a drink? And when did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick or in prison and visit you? And the king will answer them, truly, I say to you that as you did it to one of the least of these my brothers, you did it to me. Then he will say, so he's just gone through this example of separating the righteous. Then he will say to those on his left, depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry and you gave me no food. I was thirsty and you gave me no drink. I was a stranger and you did not welcome me. Naked you did not clothe me. Sick in prison you did not visit me. Then they will also answer, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty, a stranger or naked or sick or in prison, and did not minister to you? And then he will answer them, saying, truly I say to you, as you did not do this to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life. So he's just shown the judgment scene at the judgment. Well, why is this so important? Well, first of all, this is like 2 days before the Passover, he's going to be crucified on. He's got his 4 closest disciples, so he's not mincing words. He doesn't have to speak where other people who would be against him would listen and question it. He's really open to speak quite frankly to the apostles. And and he also picks the judgment scene in heaven. And what does he use as the criteria? Now, this is not the only criteria. You can read the whole rest of the Bible, and there's a lot of things that a person must do to inherit eternal life. But in this example, he's talking to his disciples, and he's talking about a righteous group of people. But what does he use as the filter? He uses whether they love their brother. That's what he uses as the filter. And so the reason why this is important is because when we teach our children to think of themselves first and think of how important they are, you miss this point entirely. That group of people will not, that group of people will be on the goat side, and that group of people will spend eternity lost. Because if you think the most important person in every room is you, if that's your goal, is to teach children that they're already little prince and princesses and they didn't do anything wrong, well, you've given them the exact opposite message that the Bible intends to give them. That is that you're actually weak, you need help, you need Jesus, and you also, the rest of your life as a Christian, you need to spend helping other people uncover this great truth. That you're weak, you need help, and you need Jesus. That's the formula for Christianity, not I'm wonderful, I'm so good, I can barely stand myself. That's the message we gave these young people. And if you haven't noticed, the generation now, after the millennials were bad, but the Gen Z and the new internet generation is worse. This disease they had of thinking too much of themselves has now come full circle. They are now, not only are they self-righteous, but they now think you're horrible for any number of reasons, which don't require you to have actually done anything. So as Christians, what I would like to do, walk away with here, is self-esteem. When you hear those words, you ought to bristle a little bit. It's not describing a healthy child that has a normal sense about who they are and what their value is. It's describing this concept where you feed them the lie that they're always good at everything, and then they're supposed to be better people. But what we've learned is it makes them worse people. The higher you think of yourself, probably the less you're going to be willing to reach out and help anybody else. And that's the mandate of Christianity, that we were helped by Christ. He died, he gave us life, and he showed us a different way. And we, the Christians that walk the earth today, are supposed to take that message out into the world and deliver it to other people. No, you're not good. You actually have sinned against the Almighty Father, the creator of heaven and earth. You've sinned against him and separated yourself. And unless you rely on Jesus Christ, you will never fix that. It's an unfixable problem. And that's what I think we need to get across to our children, even at a young age. That you're going to grow up, but you're going to always need help. You're going to need Christ. You're going to need us. And you're going to need family. The need of other people is part of the Christian model and formula.